This is a second lecture on the book of Exodus, and in this lecture we will cover Exodus chapters 1 through 18, the deliverance from Egypt. Now, if you outline the book of Exodus, you can outline the book of Exodus as follows. Exodus 1 through 18 describes the exodus from Egypt proper, the going out from Egypt that the Israelites did. Key word in this part of the book is the word deliverance. This is where God delivered the Israelites from Egyptian oppression. On the other hand, Exodus 19 through 40 describes the covenant at Mount Sinai, and the key word there will be the word covenant. Chapter 1 describes the oppression of the Hebrews. Here you have an image found from Egypt of Semitic and Nubian POWs making bricks in the 15th century. This was found in the tomb of Rechemiah in Thebes. This is the sort of thing that the Israelites did as they made bricks for the Egyptians in the oppression. In the oppression, there were taskmasters who worked the Hebrews ruthlessly in the construction of the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. Our first lecture talked a little more about Ramses. There was the killing of the male babies. When excessive work failed to cut down on Israel's population, Pharaoh commanded the slaughter of the Hebrew boy babies at birth. But the heroic midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, refused to obey Pharaoh's orders to kill the male babies. And although they lied about the reason, God nonetheless blessed their refusal to participate in Pharaoh's atrocity of killing Israelite babies. Well, this leads us to the story of the rise of Moses in Exodus 2 through 4. In chapter 2, 1 through 10, it tells the story of Moses' birth, how after he was born, he was hidden for 3 months. But hiding a baby Moses proved impossible, so his mother put him in a basket in the reeds of the Nile near where Pharaoh's daughter regularly bathed. And when the maidens of the princess discovered the baby, Pharaoh's daughter fell in love with it and adopted baby Moses as her own. And she even hired Moses' own mother as his wet nurse. Moses thus grew up in Pharaoh's household. Now, when Moses reached maturity, Moses saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating on a Hebrew slave. And angered at this, he identified with his own people and killed the taskmaster. You read about that in Exodus 2, verses 11 through 25. Moses then becomes Moses the fugitive. Word of Moses' murder of the taskmaster got out. Consequently, he fled Egypt to save his own life, going to the land of Midian in the desert. Now, in Midian, he's going to meet Jethro and Zipporah. Moses met Jethro, a Midianite priest, married one of Jethro's daughters, Zipporah, after protecting her from some ruffians at the oasis. And then you get the call of Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3 and 4. The burning bush turned out not to be a burning bush, but a manifestation of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, who was manifesting himself in order to call Moses to the task of delivering the Israelites from Egyptian oppression. Now, at that time, God revealed his name. He called himself the I Am and referred to his divine name as Yahweh. And this was an important point of God's self-revelation to Moses and to people more generally. Then you get the call of Moses. God commanded Moses to go to Pharaoh and demand that he let the Israelites go to worship Yahweh. Moses was given a staff which miraculously could turn into a snake, by which he could perform other miracles as well, that would attest to the fact that Moses' message came from deity. Now, at that time, Moses, however, tried to come up with excuses. Even Moses had excuses, and sometimes we do as well. Moses complains of his lack of eloquence, his lack of speaking skills. So God provided Moses' brother Aaron to be Moses' spokesman. And so Moses goes to Egypt with Zipporah, his wife, and his son, whom he circumcises on the way in obedience to the Abrahamic covenant. Again, this is where God reveals his name. God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say to the people, I am has sent me to you." Exodus 3 and verse 14. Now, a bit more about the name Yahweh. This came up because Moses said to God, "Suppose I say to the Israelites, and go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation." Now, I've highlighted two parts of it, I am and the Lord. The word rendered Lord with all caps, Lord, is God's personal name, Yahweh. And in most cases in the Bibles that we have today, it'll appear in small caps. So you can tell when the divine name is used when the O-R and D are capitalized. Whereas if O-R and D are not capitalized, then that's a different term for Lord. In this passage, it relates to Yahweh as being an expression of I am. Now, in Hebrew, I am is Ehyeh, and Ehyeh sounds somewhat like Yahweh. And Yahweh probably means he is in the sense of being a present help in time of need, whereas I am, Ehyeh, means I am, or I will be, or I was. Actually, the tense in Hebrew is unclear. Hebrew doesn't have ordinary tenses. But in any case, they're related sounding, and Yahweh probably means he is. Now, there is an alternative interpretation where Yahweh means he causes to be as creator. Both are defendable views. Well, this brings us to the contest with Pharaoh in Exodus 5 through 13a. Pharaoh's heart was hard in Exodus 5 and 6. When Moses came to him, Moses was told by Pharaoh, "Who is Yahweh that I should obey him?" And Pharaoh responds by oppressing the Israelites even more with higher brick quotas. And not only must they meet their brick quotas, but they must gather their own straw. And so Moses was discouraged. Now, a little bit about hardening Pharaoh's heart. Who is it that hardens Pharaoh's heart? Is it God that hardens his heart, or is it Pharaoh that hardens his own heart? And the language seems to be about 50-50 both ways. 9 times it says that God hardens Pharaoh's heart, and 9 times it indicates that either Pharaoh's heart became hard or Pharaoh hardens his own heart. Now, a little bit about the word heart. The Hebrew word is lev. In Hebrew psychology, the heart was the seat of the intellect. And so hardening Pharaoh's heart is a way of saying hardening Pharaoh's mind. In a number of passages in the Old Testament, the word lave is simply translated mind. And so when Pharaoh's heart became hard, he became stubborn and unreasonable. Now, I might mention that this has no direct relationship with salvation. Pharaoh was unsaved before his heart was hardened by God, and he was even more unsaved after his heart became hard. But what it looks like is that God providentially reinforced to absurd extremes Pharaoh's inherent stubbornness. Pharaoh was always a stubborn guy, but when God hardened his heart, he became so unreasonable that anybody with any sense would say it's not worth it to keep the Israelites here, let them go. But God hardened his heart so that he did that which was entirely absurd and unreasonable. Now, Romans 9, verses 17 through 18 comments on Pharaoh's heart and uses it as an example of God's sovereignty. It says, "For Scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. And so then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills." Now, in Calvinistic tradition, Pharaoh is seen like a puppet in the hands of Yahweh, and this principle is applied to God's election for salvation, that God chooses who he will, and he hardens who he will. Non-Calvinists tend to give more emphasis to human responsibility, noting that in Exodus, Pharaoh hardens his own heart before God hardens it. And so perhaps Pharaoh's free will has a role in this hardening as well. In any case, the Bible affirms both God's sovereignty and human responsibility, though different theological traditions work out the implications of this rather differently. Now, in the 10 plagues, God allows Moses to perform various miracles. He turns the water into blood. Frogs come out from the Nile. Mosquitoes and gnats are a plague. Flies are a plague. The cattle die in a plague. Boils are on man and bees. Hail destroys the crops. There's a locust plague. Darkness covers the land. And then finally, the plague on the firstborn, where the firstborn of man and beast die. Now, these are clearly miracles performed perfectly timed with when God, through Moses, says that they will happen. Some wonder if they aren't, in some case, a natural, supernatural thing, that, when you poison the water of the Nile, that the frogs come out and die, and then gnats and flies breed on the carcasses of the frogs, and that spreads the plague to the cattle and to the beasts and man and so forth. But whether or not it's a independent, pure miracle, or whether it's a natural, supernatural thing, God used it to confront Pharaoh, who, unfortunately for him, continued to harden his heart throughout this process. The lesson from the plague miracles is that God is sovereign. He can control the forces of nature. He can harden Pharaoh's heart at will. He's even sovereign over the gods of Egypt. Pharaoh was considered a god, Horus, and Horus in this life, Osiris after his death. Well, he had no power to fight the true God, Yahweh. The Nile was considered a god, but God turned the Nile into blood. And all the gods are powerless before Yahweh, the frog god Hecht, the bull god Apis, the cow god Hathor, the sun god Re. None of them had any power to keep these plagues from coming on Egypt. Now this brings us then to the Passover and unleavened bread in Exodus 12 and 13, where they apply the blood of the Passover lamb to the door and doorposts of the houses. The plague on the firstborn was the 10th plague, and God introduced the Passover regulation in conjunction with this plague on the firstborn. The date of the Passover occurs on the 14th of Nisan, earlier called Aviv, which occurs in March-April around Easter time in modern calendars. It is followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Passover is followed by 7 days of eating bread without yeast, and thus begins a new calendar for Israel as a new nation. And each household was to celebrate this first Passover in their own homes. Now, there's symbolism in the Passover. There's the substitutionary sacrifice. The Passover lamb served as a substitute for the firstborn, as described in chapter 12, verses 12 and 13. And only an unblemished male would do, chapter 12 and verse 5. And it inculcates the idea of substitutionary sacrifice that plays such an important role in biblical sacrificial theology. They put the blood on the doorframe of the house. Blood on the doorposts showed obedience. Where God saw the blood on that household would be spared of the plague of the firstborn. Now, part of the symbolism in the meal, they were to eat bitter herbs. It doesn't explain the meaning of the meal, but in later Jewish tradition, the bitter herbs were eaten to symbolize how their lives had been bitter in Egypt. They were to eat unleavened bread. The celebration of Passover involved 7 days of eating unleavened bread. Unleavened bread, bread without yeast, was used because there was no time to wait for the bread to rise. Exodus 12, verse 39. Thus, in Exodus, the lack of leaven is primarily a symbol of haste. Now, the New Testament will use yeast as a symbol for sin, though there's no hint of that in the Exodus account. Now, the Passover was only for spiritual Israel, and for that reason, no foreigner was to eat the Passover, since they were not the ones delivered from Egypt. That's chapter 12, verse 43. However, foreign slaves and foreign sojourners or aliens who were circumcised and thus indicate a conversion to Israelite religion could eat of the Passover. In other words, if you were part of the covenant through which would have been symbolized by circumcision, then you could participate. Chapter 12:44 and 12:48. The purpose of the Passover was to remember God's salvation. Passover's purpose, at least subsequent to the very first one, was to remember that great act of deliverance from Egyptian servitude in the Exodus story, which marks Israel's national birthday. Without Passover, there would have been no Israel. Now, there's a connection between the Passover and the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper and the New Testament pick up on Passover imagery and language. In fact, the first Lord's Supper was, in fact, a Passover celebration, as you'll read about in Matthew 6 and Mark 14 and Luke 22. And it seems to follow the first century Jewish customs of Passover in its celebration. Now, Luke mentions 2 of the 4 cups used to this day in Passover Seders. Luke 22, verse 18 records Jesus' words after blessing of the cup, "I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And this prayer echoes the traditional Jewish prayer over the cup. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Blessed are you, O Lord, King of the world, creator of the fruit of the vine. He prayed that prayer and then commented in Luke, "I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." Now, the New Testament does modify the Passover imagery, making it into the Lord's Supper imagery. The Passover lamb is replaced by Christ himself. The deliverance celebrated is not the physical deliverance from oppression, but the deliverance from sin. Now, Paul calls Christ our Passover sacrifice, who was sacrificed for us, 1 Corinthians 5 and verse 7. John comments that just as no bone was to be broken of the Passover lamb, according to Exodus 12 and verse 46, so no bone of Jesus as the unblemished Passover lamb was broken when he was crucified. And so for Christians, Passover, in a sense, is celebrated every time that we celebrate the Lord's Supper. Well, the last part of Exodus describes the Exodus proper, the going out from Egypt, and the destruction of Pharaoh's army in Exodus 13b through 15a. The route of the Exodus is disputed. Traditionally, it follows the route in the image here, going through southern Sinai Peninsula to what is, since the 4th century, been identified as Mount Sinai. The Red Sea in Hebrew is literally the Sea of Reeds, and it probably included an extension of the Red Sea that existed in ancient times, which are the Bitter Lakes, which is a little bit north of the current Red Sea, but that's silted in the intervening millennia. Exodus 15, 1 through 21 has the Song of Moses, also called the Song of Miriam, in which it describes the drowning of Pharaoh's army, which occurs in Exodus 14. Miriam, Moses' sister, plays a prominent role by leading the women in singing this Song of Moses. I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously, the horse and rider thrown into the sea. And this is a song of thanksgiving that praises God for the deliverance from Pharaoh's armies. Then they make further progress to Sinai in the last part. Exodus 15b through chapter 18. There you have a crisis of hunger and a crisis of thirst. You have a crisis of hunger. There was no food in the wilderness for the many thousands of people to eat. And so God provided the miracle of the manna. And what is manna? Well, they didn't know. The Hebrew word for manna means, what is it? And for 6 days, this manna appeared in the mornings where the food could be gathered, though it could not be gathered on the Sabbath. They had to, day before the Sabbath, they had to gather twice as much so that they would have food on the Sabbath day proper. God also provided quail for them to eat in the evenings and water from a rock. And the manna continued to appear for the 40 years of wilderness wanderings. And then there was a crisis of war. The Amalekites, an enemy of Israel, appeared in the desert. But God delivered Israel from this threat of hostilities from the Amalekites. They fought a battle that shows the power of prayer. When Moses lifted up the staff, Israel would win. But when his arms dropped, Israel would lose. Aaron and Hur then would hold up Moses' arms, a symbol of an appeal for divine aid as Moses lifted up his arms essentially in prayer, asking for God's help in the battle. And then you have a crisis of excessive workload. Moses, as leader, was overwhelmed by the tasks of leading the people and judging disputes among them. And his father-in-law gave his son-in-law Moses advice. Jethro advised Moses to allow others to help him judge the people because the task was too hard for Moses alone. He said to him, "What are you doing? This is not good. You and the people with you will certainly wear yourselves out, for the thing is too heavy for you. You're not able to do it alone, but you should look for able men from all the people, and let them judge the easy cases, and you just judge the harder cases. That's the advice that was given to Moses by his father-in-law, Jethro. Well, anyway, that's the account of the Exodus from Egypt in Exodus chapters 1 through 18. The next lecture will go on to talk about the covenant in chapters 19 through 40.